the Indiana Jones 4K UHD collection. And now it is time to open it and discover if you have finally found the one true archival release of these films. You haven't. It's iconic Lucasfilm titles handled by Paramount. Did you think it was going to be anything different? Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. This video is my review of the 4K UHD collection of the iconic, masterful Indiana Jones trilogy, plus that other film we don't like to discuss. This was released in 2021 by Paramount with Lucasfilm, although there's not a whole lot of information out there about the whole 4K restoration and new scanning process done for this release and these new masters, which have now become the standard versions and the versions that are available for streaming and are now on Disney Plus. So you can see these in all of their, supposed 4K fortune and glory. But unfortunately, as is pretty much always the case with Indy from the DVDs onward, they are not free of tweaks, and they do have some particular issues that really bug the crap out of me, in addition to not having the original audio presentations in any form. Thankfully, some of the films don't mess with their soundtracks, which is, great. They still don't sound as good as they could and as good as the original mixes do, but at least the sequels do at least fare fine in the audio department. Raiders still has massive audio remix issues, but this UHD and this 4K master does roll back a lot of the really terrible changes made for the 2012 Blu-ray release. However, this being both Lucasfilm and Paramount, the tweaks and changes here are very much on the sneaky side, and unlike the previous releases, which did have some changes done to Raiders of the Lost Ark on the DVD and Blu-ray release, those were thankfully very minor and usually are only the things that diehard fans are going to know about, like the removal of the snake reflection in the Well of the Souls. They were really only 2 or 3 minor changes done for the DVD and then carried over and redone for the Blu-ray. But now my real sticking point here is, in addition to not having the original audio and remixing the tracks again into the Atmos format, or 7.1 if you don't have an Atmos setup, it seemingly has the fingerprints of a lot of what modern Paramount is doing with their 4K so-called restorations, because they have a habit of going in and messing with all kinds of things in terms of not just the grain structure and having horrible compression and having even frozen grain and noise halos in the worst titles like their Godfather set, but they also mess with all the opticals for fades and dissolves and special effects. And what's happened here with the Indy trilogy in particular is it seems like they've gone in and tweaked every single optical shot in all 3. And if you know these films like the back of your hand and you have a good setup, or you know anything about effect shots, it's very clearly obvious that this has been done. It's not something that you're going to see all 100% of when you're watching these in normal viewing, because these are the types of tweaks and things you have to literally start to still frame through and do frame comparisons. And the wonderful 005, who's behind the incredible Star Wars visual comparisons pages on both website and Twitter, I'll link to those in the description, has actually started doing some digging into the changes and posted some of the tweaks that have been done to Raiders. And you can also see these even in the Capsaholic comparison pages, because some of the stills they chose were from effect shots, and it's quite bizarre to see some of the things they did. Some of it is, of course, erasing matte lines, which are and trying to supposedly clean certain shots up, which makes sense in one standard, but that also means you're no longer having the original shot as it was originally finished and presented. Whether it was rushed or not is inconsequential. But when you remove the matte lines, now those shots have a certain flatness to them. All the matte shots in Temple of Doom have had this, and they look noticeably different and altered from the plane crash going into the mountain in the opening, all the way to a short round breaking through the bridge, and the shot of his legs matted in obviously had really thick matte lines. But even the shots of Pankow Palace, the shots of the establishing shots of the small village, those were all matte shots, and now because they've had their lines erased, they no longer have as much depth to them. They definitely stand out and stick out like a sore thumb. That's been done to varying degrees for all the matte shots. A lot of the other effect shots have had little tweaks and things done. There's a lot of stuff going on in Raiders, for example, over the opening of the Well of the Souls, when you have the opticals of the lightning storm going on overhead. There's even been some CG usage to try and clean things up, but they've also wound up erasing or moving elements of the original shots while adding to the effect shots, which is just, this is getting into the minutia level of what you see in the Star Wars special editions. So it really does need a full frame-by-frame go-over by dedicated fans to discover every single tweak that has been done. This is not simply just, we removed the snake reflection in Raiders and we moved the rod guiding the boulder in the opening. Those were the two big tweaks done in 2003 for the DVDs, and that was pretty much it. And those were carried over to the Blu-rays. And yes, even those bothered me, but at least I could understand them and they were minor. But it really bugs me that any changes are done to the Indy trilogy in particular, because they were so inspired by classic serials, Republic serials in particular, which, due to the nature of their production, had a little element of roughness to them. They're supposed to be, these films are supposed to be a little bit rough. They're supposed to be rugged. They're supposed to be of their time. And while you are combining a 30s aesthetic and essence with the cutting edge work of ILM at that point in the 1980s, it's not going to be 100% seamless, and it wasn't meant to be. Obviously some shots originally were rushed a little, or they show their seams a bit more, but that's also part of the charm. Even Roger Ebert commented on this on his Great Movies review of Raiders of the Lost Ark, saying that he hoped they never went in and changed the effects and tried to streamline things more like what happened in the Star Wars special editions, because that would be removing some of the film's spirit and charm. And unfortunately, that's what they've done here, but it's in a very sneaky, underhanded way, and most people are going to be wondering what the heck I'm talking about. All you have to do is look at any previous video version of the three films and just look at the effects shots, the composite shots, the optical shots, the matte shots, anything. If you look at it, even compared to just the Blu-rays or the DVDs, those do not have tweaks in their effects work, because even a few years ago, this stuff was much more difficult, if not impossible, to do in terms of being this minute in the changes you're making. And the changes themselves are not perfect, as I've said. In some, they've wound up actually moving or slightly erasing some of the original material in the shot. Even if it's very small, it is a change, and quite frankly, there are mistakes. And one thing that's already been noticed by some that's rather amusing is in one of the shots of Indy over the Well of the Souls, the way they tried to cover up some original materials, some of those seams showing in the original shot, is that they literally stretched Harrison Ford. So some people have labeled it the fat Indy shot, or because it's almost got like a little bit of the old CinemaScope mumps effect with the anamorphic scope lens distortion, giving people the CinemaScope mump faces where they're kind of stretched and look a little weird. Again, this stuff is not going to be visible to most people if they're just watching these. They're just going to be marveling at the resolution and the new scan and the HDR and such, which is fine, but it is very unsettling and disquieting that the trilogy has been tweaked and manipulated to this degree, and without anybody saying anything. And it's left to us fans to notice this stuff and start digging into it further. So that is my biggest issue with this and my biggest problem, because as outdated as the old Laser Pacific scans are that were done and then used for the Blu-rays and the HD masters back in those came out in 2012. I think the masters were done and the scans were done to like 2010, 2011, something like that, and appeared on Japanese television first, and that's how you could see that the Laser Pacific scan of Raiders of the Lost Ark without the hideous color grading of the Blu-ray and theatrical runs of that horrible master. Those scans are definitely showing their age, and those discs, those Blu-rays are showing their age, especially when you watch them upscaled to 4K. However, they don't have the tomfoolery going on with the effects shots, so there is a trade-off there. So I would definitely say hang on to your Blu-rays. Don't get rid of them because they are important for that, even though the scans and those particular masterings of those discs are definitely showing their age. And I hate the Raiders Blu-ray with a passion because the color grading is so horribly revisionist, and so is the audio mix, and it ruins the good Laser Pacific scans. So the only way to see the Laser Pacific scan of Raiders properly is you have to have a version of the HD broadcast that happened on the Japanese Wow 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 channel. I think that's how you pronounce it, I guess. But you can also find comparison images of those online, and I'll link to some of those as well in the description. So that's my big problem here. First and foremost is that somebody, whether it was Lucasfilm or Paramount or both, decided to go in and spend all this time to literally redo and tweak and screw with all the effect shots in the original 3 films. That reeks of modern revisionism, and that is just unacceptable. And they didn't even do a perfect job of it. There are little goofs if you start looking at this closely. It's not done well at all, and it really sticks out like a sore thumb. Especially if you love the effects of the indie films, or you're big on the technology of old school practical film effects and how things were done in camera and with matte shots and matte paintings. If you've seen a lot of old school effects work, these are going to seem weird. You're going to be able to tell that something's off. Some is more visible than others, but when you notice one and then you start looking more closely, and then you start step framing through sequences, and then you start looking it up online and seeing some fan discussions and some comparison images, then your radar will really go off. I don't know why anyone thought this was a good idea. It is completely unnecessary, and this alone ruins the whole experience for me. I think this is absolutely unacceptable. And for all the talk about Spielberg saying, oh, he's never going to change one of his films again after doing the E.T. DVD, changing the guns into walkie-talkies, most every Spielberg film has a tweak or change in its newer masters, particularly in the 4K masters, whether it's Jaws or Close Encounters, and now even the Indy trilogy has tweaks and changes throughout all 3. It's just stuff that's not as obvious that most people aren't going to be aware of. But what would you expect from a group that even manages to screw up the opening credits of Raiders of the Lost Ark? And by that, I mean, it looks like they may have redone the opening titles in terms of trying to make them look nice and spiffy for this new master. But like most catalog titles on UHD with 4K masters and HDR, unfortunately the titles do seem a bit bright, and they do have that pop-out effect because they're all, or well, at least for Raiders and Crusade, they are white titles for the most part, so they really have that over-bright effect in HDR, unfortunately. But the problem is actually the main credit to open Raiders, South America 1936, that comes up after the discovery of the Jovito's poison dart. Well, they messed up the placement and the runtime of that credit, because if you know Raiders very well and you put in the UHD, you'll notice something is off right at the get-go, because the credit comes up at a different point and then holds and stays for too long and then has a long fade out. So apparently somebody decided the original South America 1936 credit wasn't good enough, so they were going to redo it. and they didn't even take the time to match the placement and the timing. So as soon as Raiders starts on this new 4K presentation, you've already got an error that is quite notable because the credit just sits there for an extra few seconds and doesn't go away, and then it slowly fades out. And then you're like, I don't remember it doing that. Let me go double check some of my old copies, and as soon as you do that, you're like, holy crap, how did they screw that up? And then you move into the audio side, and once again, we have no version or presentation of the original audio mixes for the original trilogy of films. This even goes for Crystal Skull, although I think that was just brought into the realm of 7.1 in Atmos from the original 5.1 mix. But at least Temple and Crusade and even Crystal Skull, if you want to acknowledge it, those sound like themselves. They have not gone in and messed around with the design of the tracks. It seems like what they did was take the pre-existing lossless 5.1 tracks for those three films and brought them into the Atmos realm by using the additional height channels and trying to bring them into more of a spatial environment by allowing them to open up more freely. But they're not, they don't seem like they're remixed from scratch in terms of they went back to original stems and did a brand new Atmos remix. They seem very much based around the lossless 5.1 tracks of the Blu-ray releases. And again, there's no real information about this, so I'm just having to make my best educated guess. That's just what they seem like to me. Raiders, on the other hand, is still a giant problem. Thankfully, this is not the same horribly revisionist, in-your-face, terrible remix as was on the 2012 Blu-ray. However, like the others, it is an Atmos track based on that mix. That mix was supervised by Ben Burtt, the legendary sonic guru behind all of the Lucasfilm titles, including the sounds of Indy. But what he did on that Blu-ray remix, or whoever was, in charge of the final mix itself, I don't know if it was Bert in particular, they played around with all the effects, they added new ones, they changed all the levels, the music no longer sounded as full and as integrated, neither did the dialogue, and they just messed around with the whole sound field, plus they made a brand new LFE track that was constantly active and way too overbearing, and they really tore the mix apart, and I can't stand that mix of the film. Now, thankfully, that has been sort of tamed down here, because essentially what they seem to have done is take the Blu-ray 5.1 remix, completely tame down that overactive in-your-face LFE, so that's no longer an issue. But everything else is that remix audio with those changes. But now they've brought it into Atmos and they've expanded it. So now all of the tearing apart of the sound field of the original mixes is now allowed to spread out even further and now have overhead activity. And the problem with the levels and the whole mix no longer sounding integrated is really compounded further because of the additional spreading out, essentially, of the sound field. So it is technically better than the Blu-ray remix. It's basically a version 2 of the Blu-ray remix. It's tweaking it, but it's also magnifying some of the baked-in problems to that mix, and I think is a horrible sounding version of this film. I think both the Blu-ray of Raiders and the UHD of Raiders are no way to experience the magic of this film in the sonic realm. I think they both sound atrocious, especially when you know how this film should sound. Now, Raiders did have multiple original mixes done in 1981, a Dolby Stereo mix for 35mm, a Dolby 70mm mix in terms of the 6-track Dolby system. There was a custom mono mix with differences made that has never been officially released on video. Like Star Wars, it did have some different bits of dialogue and differences unique to that mono mix, and pieces of it show up in various ways, even some official things sometimes, which is really bizarre to see. But then there was also a track prepared for the Vistasonic system, which was very short-lived. It was backed by Paramount and used on Dragon Slayer and Popeye, and then it was dropped before the premiere of Raiders because of some technical issues in the system that were never quite ironed out, and they just kind of gave up on it. So as far as the story goes, Raiders was then remixed and presented printed in Dolby Stereo only, and Dolby 70mm, and then the custom mono mix. So technically there are 4 original mixes of Raiders, and only 3 had some sort of theatrical issue or on other options like 16mm and such. Then it comes the video releases, which all seem to have used the Dolby Stereo mix for all the Laserdisc, the VHS, and beta releases up until the early 1990s. Of course, these were all pan and scan, but the Dolby Stereo mix of Raiders sounds wonderful. It's very full-bodied. It's probably the most dynamic of all of the mixes of Raiders, but it just doesn't have a lot of surround activity because this is a matrixed 1981 Dolby Stereo track. It's not... No track from that era is going to have a whole ton of surround activity, with a few exceptions. But that is still a phenomenal sounding version of the film because it is one of the original mixes of the film and is my second favorite overall. Because when they prepared a letterbox master for the Laserdisc release, they somehow got an alternate track source. It is still unknown what this track is from, but it is my favorite sounding version of Raiders without question. It is so much more alive than any other version I've heard. It has much more surround activity, and it also has one difference. There's a different sound effect when Indy drops the staff into the map room for some reason. So my guess has always been either this is that abandoned Vistasonic mix, which was a 4-channel system, or it could possibly be a home video remix done at this time, like what would happen with the Star Wars Definitive Collection Laserdisc set in 1993, which had custom remixes done for Dolby Surround in the homes from mostly original 70mm mix stem sources, like what was supposed to have happened on the indie DVDs. So the Raiders Laserdisc, I think, is the best sounding version of the film, and the version I recommend everybody check out because it's also widescreen, and it's the last version to not have any changes applied to it. That's in a quality higher than VHS, if you want to count the final 1999 letterbox VHS release of the trilogy. But that is the best sounding version of Raiders, the widescreen Laserdisc, and it wipes the floor with every other version. For those without a Laserdisc player, there are, of course, the 2003 DVDs, which had 5.1 tracks that were supposedly derived from the original 70mm mixes of the films. I've never found that officially confirmed anywhere, but that's the little bit of info that always gets shared over and over. The 5.1 on all 3 sounds great, and I still actually prefer the 5.1 on all 3 of the DVDs to the Blu-rays and the UHD. However, the 5.1 on Raiders, I just don't think it sounds as good as the Laserdisc matrixed 2.0 surround, and also the surrounds on the 5.1 AC3 of the Raiders DVD do seem a tad elevated, perhaps. So that's another thing. But again, as with any Lucasfilm property, none of this stuff is ironed out or easy to figure out, and you have to sort of cobble this information together for yourself. So all of this I'm saying has been years of me researching the different editions, watching different versions, and comparing the audio and trying to find any scrap of information I could, and then checking my findings and going back and forth. So this is years of indie research I've done in regards to the technical aspects. But long story short, the audio of Raiders is a giant problem, and having no original option is not good. So I think not only are the UHDs of the trilogy extremely problematic, and for me ruined by the choice to go in and screw with their effect shots, I think they're also ruined by not having any version of the original audio. Ironically, the old Blu-rays actually did have a quasi-original option, because if you went to the foreign language dubs, there was an old lossy mono dub. I think it's the Portuguese dub, maybe. But on the Raiders Blu-ray, that was the only original option you had, because when there wasn't dub dialogue, it was a pretty healthy sounding version of a mono mix of the film, and that was the only technically original option there was on the disc, and the UHDs have all removed that. So I am not a fan of of the changes done to the picture. And I think the audio of Raiders in terms of this new Atmos remix is absolutely atrocious, because the film's sound has basically been ripped apart to within an inch of its life, and the dialogue has a canned quality to it in the Atmos remix, and the music sounds dulled. And the last thing you ever want is for the John Williams music of Raiders of the Lost Ark to sound dulled and removed from the film experience. If you have any of the older versions, I encourage you to just pop them on and just pick a scene and compare the difference. A key example would be the shootout in the Raven Bar, because you have all the wonderful ricochets going around, and it's a really impressive moment for a 1981 film in terms of sound design. And then you compare, even the DVD to the Blu-ray and this new Atmos track, and you'll notice a significant altering of the sound field. And if you have the Raiders Laserdisc, it is an unbelievably more impressive experience from the introduction of Indiana Jones. That moment alone, with the whip crack and the music sting and the gunshot reverberating in the darkness of the jungle, that's demo worthy still to this day. So those are my problems with the Raiders audio mix. As for Temple and Crusade, as I said before, thankfully, it seems like they just expanded upon the lossless 5.1 tracks from the Blu-rays, which themselves didn't seem really different from the 5.1 tracks on the DVDs. They do still retain the dialogue panning that's in both films. There is a bit of dialogue panning across the front channels, left to right, right to left, which is a fascinating older technique that I really miss and something I adore finding in films, and quite frequently gets removed. So it's nice to see that was still retained. However, there's just always been something about Temple and Crusade in terms of all the modern releases where they just don't have the same impact that I'm used to, because I grew up watching these on VHS, which were derived from the Laserdisc masters, and I've watched the Laserdisc mostly over the years. Those are my favorite versions. And while they don't have discrete audio and they have matrix stereo, so 4-channel matrix from 2.0 PCM, none of the DVDs or the Blu-rays or the UHDs now with these latest remixes have that same punch to them, even though they're discrete and now you can hear them in Atmos and most people will think they sound fine. They don't have that same intensity. They don't have they don't seem as dynamic either in a lot of ways. So I'm sure they went in and did some EQing and some essentially some taming of the soundtrack, because that's pretty much part and parcel with every modern release of a film. So it's just one of those things where you put on the Blu-ray or UHD of Temple of Doom, and which has one of the most aggressive sound mixes of the 1980s, and it sounds fine, it sounds loud in places, but it doesn't really grab you. I think the DVD sounds a little bit different too. It's just, again, probably some differences in EQing and levels. So I don't know if I could ever pick a clear winner between those three, but the Laserdisc audio of Temple of Doom, even though its matrix is so gloriously in your face and engaging, it's one of the most aggressive Dolby Surround tracks I've ever heard, or Matrix tracks in general. It is ridiculously aggressive, and that is my preferred way to watch Temple of Doom. Even though it's not a discrete track, that audio is that amazing. So that's another thing where that's another reason why I go back to the Laserdisc. Last Crusade was mixed differently. It's not as aggressive as Temple of Doom, but it has a beautifully detailed mix, and it was mixed and recorded in a THX designed recording hall and room, and it did have split surrounds on the 1989 70mm release, so it's technologically a lot more advanced. But it has a great mix for 1989, and again, for some reason, the Matrix Laserdisc, which is probably based on the 35mm Printmaster Dolby Stereo SR track, it just sounds more alive. It just sounds punchier in the right places. It sounds more open. It's more engaging when I watch it, and I did do some spot comparisons between all of these, and every time, even though the actual track didn't really seem changed like Raiders has been several times now, both Temple and Crusade don't sound as good as they do on the old Laserdisc, even though they're not discrete. Not everyone may agree with me on this, but that's just my own findings, and that's what I keep finding every time I go back and rewatch the trilogy and I compare it to the DVDs and the Blu-rays and now the UHDs, and I'm scratching my head and I'm like, well, how can these old Matrix tracks sound this good? And it's like with a lot of things done at that time, they were done without messing with the audio or trying to make sure they sounded good for streaming or somebody watching them on their phone. So I encourage people, if you do have a bunch of different editions, to just try some comparisons for yourself. Compare the minecart chase and Temple of Doom across different formats, or the tank chase in Last Crusade, an easy one, for example, because I don't think these tracks sound as good as they originally did. Now, Crystal Skull, I've never been a giant fan of its mix. I think it's okay. I think it's good for the time, but I think it relies too much on boominess and the LFE channel for the bigger parts of the action sequences. And to be honest, there's not even a whole lot of those. It only gets really active in the most bombastic moments of the set pieces. So it seems like that was just brought into Atmos from the mix that was on the Blu-ray, and just it's expanded a little, and maybe because of that there's not as much boominess to it as it was on just the straight ahead lossless 5.1, which is very much a 2007 mix. Now that 2007 mix has been expanded upon and sort of spread out a bit in the Atmos realm. So at least you get that now if you like to sit through Crystal Skull, which I admittedly do not. I try to kind of ignore Crystal Skull, if I'm honest, but I did rewatch it for purposes of with Dial of Destiny coming out and reviewing this UHD set. Now to talk about the color grading and the application of Dolby Vision HDR on these transfers. All of these are brand new 4K scans. They are completely brand new in terms of their grading and how they were handled as compared to the Blu-rays, which were again derived from the Laser Pacific scans that were done a couple years beforehand. Raiders, unfortunately for the Blu-ray, got the horrible yellow and orange color timing applied to it that was really in vogue at the time. I guess they were trying to make it look more like Crystal Skull. I saw an advanced screening of that from a new 35mm print that had been made of this new version of Raiders, and so that's how I first knew that something was horribly wrong with the color timing and the visuals. Thankfully, the UHD has been handled in a different way. Because this was done completely from scratch, it does not have the color timing issues of the Raiders Blu-ray. So that is a big relief right off the bat, but you then have to deal with the issue of all the effect shots being messed with. So there are further and new changes made to Raiders, even though they did address the color timing issues of the Blu-ray. That's not to say that I think the color timing is perfect for 100% of the film. There were moments where I thought it did look a little bit off. I don't know what their grading reference was, because again, there's not really any information about this restoration process, and we are talking about Paramount, who do have a lot of issues in terms of their restorations and 4K presentations. So I do think this is thankfully an improvement in the color timing dramatically over the Raiders Blu-ray, but I don't think it's perfect. I do think there are some moments in really all of the trilogy that do look a little bit off, or they don't seem to match how the photography was designed for those sequences. That may be just me having a lot of history with the indie films, but there were definitely a few moments in all three where it's kind of like, well, that seems kind of dodgy. But at least we don't have the horrible problems of the Raiders Blu-ray color timing. Temple and Crusade, as I've said, they look good. They are obviously dramatic improvements because they are new 4K scans, so they are technologically much more advanced than the old Laser Pacific scans. All you have to do is pop in the old Blu-rays of a scene, or just the start, and in Club Obi-Wan of Temple of Doom, for example, to see the dramatic difference between a 2012 Blu-ray and a 2021 UHD from a new 4K scan. However, once again, you have to deal with the fact that all the effect shots have been tweaked and changed and messed with. So that's your trade-off. Again, there are maybe one or two spots, not as much as in Raiders, but there are a couple or handful of spots in both Temple and Crusade where I thought the color timing seemed definitely a bit different. It is much more naturalized and nuanced in terms of doing things that even the Blu-rays could not. So the red lights of the Temple of Doom itself, the red lighting of the caves does seem to come across more. The desert terrain in Last Crusade, like around the tank chase, or some of the interiors inside the castle when Indy is going to rescue his dad. Those seem to have more texture, obviously, and they definitely come across more than all the years of older video transfers. So you do get the benefits of a new 4K scan and a 4K UHD over an aging Blu-ray. And interestingly, some things have been done with Crystal Skull's color timing, because this has had the 2007 teal and orange, or whatever you want to call it, yucky color timing that was so in vogue back then and is on the Blu-rays of Crystal Skull. That's been removed. So I guess that was that original color timing was done late in the game or in post, probably digitally color graded. And so when they went back to the original elements and they did this, they just didn't put that back in. So this has a much more naturalized look to it. It still is Crystal Skull, so I still think it looks like crap, because the photography of Crystal Skull and the visuals are just horrible. I think thought they were when I saw the film at midnight on the midnight release back in 2007. But you at least don't have the awful sort of yellow orangey filtering over it. But that also means it's not 100% reflective of the original release. So it's technically a revisionist change in that sense. So, as much as I hate the yellowy look, you do want to hang on to the Blu-ray for the actual 2007 look of Crystal Skull. But that was really striking, because I didn't think they would do something like that, because most people just kind of want to forget about Crystal Skull. So again, my guess is that it was just part of the post-processing, and when they did this new 4K scan, it was obviously not in the source, and they decided to not replicate the 2007 grading. So that's going to be a positive for most people, I think, because now Crystal Skull can be seen in higher resolution from a newer scan, so it's not the aging Blu-ray master, and you can see it without the horrible yucky yellowiness. Now we come into what does the HDR do for these. Now, for the most part, the HDR is a nice improvement in terms of making the visuals more dynamic. The only thing I have an issue with is on the original trilogy, there are definitely some moments where it seems like it's a bit too much. There are, unfortunately, some pop-out moments where there's like a flash of HDR brightness being too much and sort of taking you out of the visuals a little bit. Thankfully, they're more on the minor side, but I definitely noticed them. There's a couple of shots where it's some of the skies that seem a bit bright, but it's particularly around objects, I noticed. So when Indy or Shorty is waving around a torch inside the Temple of Doom. Well, when Shorty waves the torch in front of the camera, the actual flame of the torch kind of wants to pop out a little bit. It's HDR pop out is usually found around bare sources. It's usually, especially if you have like a bare light bulb or the headlights of a car or something. So I think that's why it was rather obvious with the torch. Also, it's even on smaller objects or stationary objects, like the sort of metal chrome accents on the wooden doors of their rooms in Penco Palace, when they have the screwball comedy bit with Willie and Indy and the 5 minutes gag. Well, when they're opening and closing the doors, the metal accents keep picking up the lights, and they really, in this HDR, they want to just pop out, which is unfortunate. So you will notice some things like that, and I really feel iffy about using HDR on catalog titles to begin with, because I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, and it does unfortunately mean that it's going to be somebody else decades after the fact doing this HDR grading, and them themselves deciding on what they think is best for the image to make it pop on a 4K display, when it's not necessarily what was intended by the cinematographer that day when that scene was shot. So it's a real tightrope to walk, and thankfully it's mostly okay. But if you're sensitive to HDR and catalog titles, and you're especially sensitive to sort of little pop out moments where the HDR is too much, unfortunately there are a number of those in the original trilogy. So that was disappointing, and to be honest, I'm really getting burned out on HDR with catalog titles. But thankfully it's for the most part, it's solid, and it's okay. Essentially, I wish the Dolby Vision grading had been just done a little bit more carefully, because it definitely seems like there are some places where it was not done as carefully. And then you run into more of the classic Paramount issues, because I don't know how this didn't get spoken about in a lot of the reviews, which pretty much unanimously gave this set a perfect rating for the video score. But there are some notable compression issues, as you see in a lot of Paramount releases. It's thankfully nowhere near as bad as obviously what's in The Godfather and some of the worst offenders in the Paramount UHD catalog. But there are some moments where the grain of the actual film grain does kind of get a little bit held up. There are a couple spots, some very minute haloing going on in terms of some noise halos around some people's heads and stationary objects. It's very minute though, so it's not like the giant force field frozen noise halos in the Godfather transfer. But that was disappointing to see a couple small bits of haloing and stuff. But the other thing is there are massive amounts of compression noise in places. Particularly, it's very noticeable in shots with big open skies in them. And all you have to do is you just go to the Tanis dig scene right before the map room in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And actually, even in the map room, there's still compression noise in there. And it's inconsistent, so it seems to come and go. So frequently these can look great, but when the compression noise really pops up, it's very noticeable. But when Indy's standing over the map room next to Sala, and he's about to drop the staff in, and we have the whole wide shot, and you see the sky behind Indy, obviously it has film grain in the image, but you're also going to notice all this other noise and junk in there, and it moves, and it also gets stagnant, and it's just very yucky looking, and it should not be there. And unfortunately, this rears its ugly head in Temple of Doom and Last Crusade, and even to some extent in Crystal Skull. But I try to just not think about Crystal Skull if possible. And this just has the earmarks of Paramount compression issues. And the thing is, it is visibly there, and reviewers should notice and comment on these things, but unfortunately most reviews of this set didn't mention this at all. And I was very surprised to see this, because I'm looking at these now on a 4K OLED television. I don't have a top tier model, I just have a Sony A80J, and it's only 55 inches, so I don't even have the largest screen size possible. But even I could clearly notice the compression issues start at the beginning of Raiders and keep popping up, and then especially when you have big clear skies, and then you just see all this junk compression noise keep popping up. It's just like, who okayed this? Who QC'd this? I don't think anybody QC'd this, because it's Paramount. But if you're sensitive to compression issues, or you've had issues with seeing this stuff on Paramount discs before, where the compression and the encoding of the actual disc itself definitely lowers your enjoyment factor, unfortunately it rears its ugly head in these indie UHDs, and is another unfortunate part of this being handled by the current lineup at Paramount, who seem to be perfectly fine with issues like this. So There are definite compression issues in the indie UHDs. It's not quite as bad as a lot of other Paramount titles, but it's definitely there. And depending on your display and how sensitive you are to things like this, it is very much visible when it pops up, which is a darn shame because, again, from a technical standpoint, these scans are so far beyond what was even on the Blu-rays. And if they hadn't gone in and screwed with the effects, and if the HDR grading was a little bit more careful, these could have been really stupendous, perfect video rating discs, like what most of the reviews claim they are, and they're not. I also think not having the original audio is a major problem. So unfortunately, for the technical standards of this release, I don't really ever see myself returning to it. And as outdated as the old 2012 Blu-rays look when you pop them on after watching the UHDs and upscale to 4K, all the noise and things is so much more obvious, and it's not as detailed, obviously. And the Blu-rays are scans dating back to like 2010 or 2009 even. They don't have the manipulation going on and the effects for Temple and Crusade. And, Raiders are just kind of screwed because the Blu-ray is terrible and the UHD is really problematic. And neither has a good sounding version of the original audio. And I think both of them have terrible audio. So Raiders is still kind of a pick your poison choice. But it's just a darn shame because this should have been a great UHD set, and I don't know why they spent all this extra time and money to take perfectly good new 4K scans and just screw them up by going in and screwing with the effects and then not making sure the color timing was on point 100%, not providing the original audio tracks, and doing more work to the pre-existing audio from the Blu-rays by remastering them into Atmos. And also not really providing any new extras either. That's so yeah. It's still a Paramount affair. That's going to be underlined and highlighted when you go through this set. If you know anything about how Paramount 4K releases are done, this has all the hallmarks, unfortunately, of a modern Paramount 4K release. So to then talk about the packaging, artwork, and then talk some about the special features, we have the UHD set here, which once again reuses the same image of Harrison Ford that was used on the DVD set and the Blu-ray set, both of which have much fancier packaging and also had textured artwork, whereas this is just flat and glossy with a very flimsy sort of slip box. At least it's sturdier than the really crummy Godfather set they made. But, this just reeks of, okay, they just slap this together, and then the rear is just a generic map photo. And then we get the very flimsy and generic fold-out digipack inside. At least this does have actual holders for the disc, but the artwork, to say this is uninspired, I mean, just this could be the definition of uninspired. These are the indie films. How do you make such generic artwork? Also, this is very flimsy in terms of you can literally just twist it in your hands. It's just you'll want to be careful handling this, because if you handle it a lot over the years, it will eventually wear, break, tear, and possibly rip as well. The disc labels are unfortunately also very generic, but at least, as I said, we do have actual holders for the discs, unlike the Blu-ray set, which had the stupid cardboard slot pages, which will scratch your discs up. So we have the 4 UHDs plus a bonus Blu-ray. Unfortunately, the bonus Blu-ray is exactly the same disc from the 2012 Blu-ray set, just with a new label thrown on it. So there is nothing new in terms of it being a new extra disc. It's just literally the old disc with a new label slapped on it. Also, in terms of cutting corners and reusing stuff, the menus for the UHDs themselves, actually copy the Blu-ray menus. So it's the same little footage clips, the same design, exactly identical to the Blu-rays, except now it's on a UHD and it has less options, and they've removed some of the foreign language dubs and things. So that aforementioned lossy old mono dub track of Raiders, that was the only mostly original audio mix of Raiders on the Blu-ray, is now gone on the UHD, as is the one for Temple of Doom and Crusade as well. In terms of custom inserts and packaging, we have this little tiny fold-out that is just shoved inside the digipack. I will give Paramount that at least with this, they made some sort of fold-out, but it's just this rather simplistic image collage of all 4 films with the sort of map motif. I mean, it makes sense, but it's not really enough for the indie films, and it's just kind of thrown together. On the flip side, we do at least get nice images of the original poster one sheets, but even these are just kind of thrown on here, and the actual quality is, it's okay, but there are some definite color casts on these that are not reflective of how brilliant these 4 original posters actually are. But, again, we don't usually get any sort of printed material insert in a Paramount set, so I give them that, but, the indie sets across home video have never been super fancy. The fanciest is still the Japanese Laserdisc trilogy box set, which had a nice black and white insert, but it's very it's a very refined box. It's not a big fancy thing with a lot of materials. It's very classy, and that carried over to the DVDs, even though they didn't have an insert, and then that sort of carried over to the Blu-rays, even though it had the terrible cardboard disc slot pages. We also get the original, or I should say the original printed ad from the rear, so I kept that. It's very straightforward. It looks okay, but it's nothing fancy. And then on the rear, they did actually put the credits. So this is where the credits of the films are. So don't throw away your the little glued-on rear card from the actual outer box, because otherwise you throw away the credits of the films. And also, when you shove the little fold map thing back in here, you want to be careful to line it up, and to line up the digipack, because it's so flimsy. It does take some time to actually line it up and then slide everything back in, because if you're not careful, you're going to tear or wrinkle something. And again, it's just impossible to get over the feeling of this is a very cheap set in terms of the manufacturing. So if you wound up paying the full list price for this, and you got it home and you took the plastic off and you felt how cheap and flimsy it was, you'd be very upset. So it does go for nice affordable sale prices, which do at least make it feel a little bit better. But yeah, this is definitely not up to the quality standards of either the DVD box or the Blu-ray box, because again, for comparison's sake, while this is just another slip box, they did go for the nice weathered effect. It's textured. It's embossed for the title. We have this lovely custom spine, which is also embossed, which was designed to look like an old book or suitcase or tome. And it was also later made when they did the Young Indie DVDs, they matched those to this design. And then on the rear, we even got imagery from the original Last Crusade poster, nicely aged and things. And the DVDs had custom designs for this new set in terms of the color and the layout for all the films. And then we even got the exclusive bonus disc. And the documentaries from here, of course, are still the major bulk of the bonus materials on the 2012 Blu-ray, which was then copied over for the UHD set. So unfortunately, we don't get any new extras for the UHD set. It would have been nice to at least gotten a short piece about the making of the UHDs, so we at least know something about what they did. And then for comparison's sake, here is the Blu-ray set, which is not only embossed with the same imagery, it's also got a nice sort of hollow foil effect on it. Also, It's a nice harder case too. And of course, you have the spines, which are pretty much the same because Paramount literally just copied the Blu-ray box art. But if that weren't enough, when you take the J card off, you're going to see something very familiar because it's the exact same image as what was just used on here. But it no longer has the sort of hollow foil aged effect of this Blu-ray set. So they pretty much took the artwork of the Blu-ray set and slapped it onto this flimsy 4K UHD little box they designed. And then when you slid out this, we got the actual book with the cardboard slot pages, but at least it had more imagery, had a custom page for each of the films, and we got standardized labels for the Blu-rays, but at least they fit with the design of the Blu-ray set. And then, of course, the credits were actually printed on the actual set instead of just thrown on the little glued-on card on the back. As for the extras, I'm still disappointed that we're just stuck with the same Blu-ray disc recycled. While that did add some extra vintage footage of the making of Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was the one new exclusive highlight, was fascinating. And it did finally give us an on-disc official version on the main releases of the classic Making of Raiders documentary. It didn't give us the vintage promo features for Last Crusade, which was Great Adventurers and Their Quests, and everything else is still based around the DVD documentaries and featurettes. Thankfully, it did carry over those 2008 exclusive featurettes for the standalone Indie Trilogy DVD reissues, so I didn't have to hang on to those. But there should have been something new for this UHD set. There should have been new extras. There should have at least been an inclusion of all the other materials, like that Last Crusade documentary from '89. So to have at least a complete archival supplements package of all the stuff that was pre-existing. But again, they just merely made a new copy of the 2012 Blu-ray and just slapped a new label on it. So that's really unfortunate. You would think for the indie films we could actually get legitimate extras if, so many genre films can get beautiful 4K releases with feature-length documentaries these days. You would think that we could get something for the indie films, but again, this is Paramount, and they didn't even do anything for their big Godfather rollout either, so I think that's to be expected, unfortunately. So, in summary, I have major issues with this release. I think it has major flaws. I can't really recommend this for those, simply for the technical reasons, but chiefly the decision to go in and mess with the original effects of the trilogy. That is a major deal breaker for me, and the only reason I went ahead and purchased this set is because I wanted to see the material for myself, see how intensive these changes could be, and also to look at the 4K masters and the HDR grading and things, and see what had happened to the picture and sound for all four. So, is it an improvement over the Blu-rays? Technically, yes. It is a much newer scan. Most people seem to be perfectly happy with this, or most people would probably find this a significant improvement, which is understandable. But it's very, very concerning that these issues keep happening in terms of this quiet revisionism. But it's very apparent here on the indie films because it's most, if not all, of the effect shots have been tweaked in some fashion, and that really does bug me, and I have major issues with that because you wouldn't go in and change an effect in King Kong because it looked a little ropey. I mean, even though Warner Brothers did remove a visible element from a dirty frame for their Blu-ray release, that was still present on their DVD release of the same scan. But I noticed too much of these things, and then I carry them around in my head. That the tweaks done are a major problem. Then add in not having any original audio presentations for all 4 films, and Raiders having major audio problems because they're just reworking the terrible Blu-ray remix. I think it sounds terrible even in this Atmos reimagining of the remix. And then I think the HDR could be a little bit better in some spots, but thankfully it's mostly okay and helps these new transfers. But then you have these compression issues that are part and parcel with it being a Paramount release. So this, unfortunately, along with the no new extras and the cheap flimsy packaging that took no effort because it just copied the Blu-ray set packaging, this is full of all the hallmarks of Paramount 4K problems because Paramount's going to Paramount. So I can't recommend this. And to be honest, even though the Blu-rays are really showing their age for Temple and Crusade, they don't have the revisionism of the UHDs, and they don't have the 5.1 remixes brought into Atmos and remixed further. So yeah, they're going to show more warts and things, and that they're Laser Pacific scans from 2010 or whenever they were done when you upscale them to 4K, but they haven't been messed around with in the ways that the UHDs have. And again, Raiders, you're just kind of screwed, because if you're a purist and you think about these things, neither option, Blu-ray or UHD, is good to go with. The Blu-ray is terrible, and the UHD still has a lot of problems, and they've screwed with the effects. So, unfortunately, I don't think either one is a good choice. So that's why for years I've always just rewatched the trilogy on the Laserdisc releases, because I'm a Laserdisc enthusiast. I really enjoy watching those Laserdiscs. They're great for their time period, and I do have a good LD setup, and they do sound the best of any version I've tried. So that's another great help. Plus, they're actually in widescreen. And yes, I enjoy watching old analog transfers sometimes because I enjoy the format. I take it for what it is. But I watch those and I don't have to worry about revisionism and screwing with the effects and moments of dodgy color timing or compression issues. I do notice, obviously, the issues of an older analog media format, but I understand those, and those are inherent to the format. So that's actually how I enjoy the indie films most, because I'm able to just not worry about all the modern transfer stuff that I have issues with, and I'm just able to enjoy the films with the best sounding soundtracks that I'm aware of on home video. And don't think I haven't tried to look at every version I can. So those are just my thoughts and reviewing the 4K UHD collection of the Indiana Jones films from Paramount. Unfortunately, I think this is a seriously flawed release, and most of that is all down to Paramount making decisions that they really should not have. And in terms of whoever it was that okayed the screwing with the effects, I mean, that is... It's done at the level of the revisionism of, you know, the George Lucas director's cut of THX or the Star Wars special editions. It's done at that minute level of all kinds of weird tweaks. And yes, it's only the effect shots, but it's still changes and tweaks, and there was no need for any of this, because it does, I think, go against the spirit of these films and the spirit of retaining the flavor of a classic Republic serial, which is why Indiana Jones exists in the first place. So you have to be critical of any Lucasfilm title on home video because of the incessant revisionism of picture and sound and effects of all Lucasfilm properties, because it's happened to all of them. I mean, there's no reason why we can't have Raiders on UHD properly transferred without any changes, with perfectly accurate color timing and HDR, and all the original sound mixes, including the mono mix, which has different elements to it. You know, that there's no reason we can't have nice archival presentations, but unfortunately we have to deal with Lucasfilm and Paramount, and whoever was involved most, or whoever did these changes, or if it was one entity alone instead of both of them, that's why I have major issues with this release. So It's a tough sell, I think, for any videophile and any cinephile and even indie fans, because there are some massive problems that they just no one has discussed, and the decision alone to screw with the effect shots and not say anything is a major red flag and should be addressed. And I just don't see myself returning to this, and it's a shame because the new scans and the new work seems great, but on top of the effects being screwed with and the not so good audio and the screwed up audio on Raiders, you then have to deal with no new extras and the poor, crappy compression and encoding courtesy of Paramount. It seems every aspect of these discs is about as straightforward and without effort as they possibly could be. The only efforts were in going in and screwing with the films, and even Crystal Skull has now had its original color timing removed and altered. Even though I do think it is an improvement, it's still a change and an aspect of revisionism. Whether this was all done by Paramount or if it was Lucasfilm and Disney, it is unknown because there is no information about any of this, which is really perplexing because this is starting to get into Star Wars trilogy type revisionism in terms of going in and screwing with original effect shots and even having to go frame by frame and do these frame comparisons and compare to all these different versions. On top of that, we don't have any original audio presentation for the original trilogy films. Any of their original audio mixes, none of those are here, but thankfully at least Temple and Crusade aren't screwed with all that much, but they don't sound as boisterous as they used to. It's just really unfortunate because there's really good new base scans that were done, and combined with HDR grading that and color timing that I'm not 100% on and I think could be better and I don't think was done as carefully and appropriately as it should have been, it means I don't think there's an upside to this release, unfortunately. And once you get over the initial wow factor of seeing the Indie Trilogy in 4K with a new HDR grade, it quickly falls apart real fast, at least for me, because the first major thing is no original audio. That's a major deal breaker for me. I think that ruins any film experience, to be honest, but I know I'm a purist, and I know not everyone feels that way. So then you have to look at all the video issues I've highlighted and how the films have been manipulated, so they are no longer 100% accurate and original to their original release or presentation. So they've been altered, even though it's in much more less obvious sort of ways. The more you dig into this, the more frustrating it becomes. And then you realize this is Paramount, who continues to have these issues, and they don't put effort into these box set packages, and they just crank these things out. There's no new extras. The packaging is flimsy and cheap. And it's such a missed opportunity. And these are the indie films. And you'd think there'd be something by now for treating them properly on home video. I do think it is ridiculous that we continue to have these problems both with Paramount and Lucasfilm titles. It is ridiculous that in 2023 we still do not have a decently archival presentation copy of the Indiana Jones trilogy on the latest available format that is the version in circulation. There is no version that the public can easily access of the original 3 films, and now even Crystal Skull, that has not had some sort of change applied and actually has the original audio mix. Everyone is going to now be looking at these further altered 4K masters with all of these problems baked in, and most people are only going to be looking at them on streaming services or on Disney Plus, which will compound these problems due to streaming compression and having, lossy versions or lesser versions of the remixed audio presentations here on the UHDs. And these become the versions in circulation, and these become the versions of record. And they're not versions of record. They are not archivally minded. They have changes baked in. So in spite of Spielberg's claims and all of the clickbait articles and videos about how none of his films will ever have changes again after the E.T. DVD debacle, well, guess what? They do. And this is not an isolated incident. Most of if not the majority of Spielberg's catalog of films have tweaks and changes in them, even on the 4K presentations, whether it's the Indy trilogy, Close Encounters, even Jaws, and this goes into the audio mix preservation as well, because it's not easy to hear the best available version of the original audio mix of any of these films, because you have to do a lot of research and work and go back to dead media formats, because you have to preserve the stuff yourself, because the people in charge don't care about preserving films accurately or properly, as evidenced by this 4K UHD release of the Indiana Jones collection from Paramount. So, as always, I hope my babblings about classic films, Indiana Jones, and physical media releases have been somewhat fun and informative. If you yourself have viewed the UHDs and noticed some of these issues, or perhaps didn't notice them at all, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you love the UHD presentations, that's fine. I would love to continue the discussion further. That's why I do these videos, is to generate discussion. And when I come across things like this, where there's such a history of revisionism and it just does not get discussed openly, and then you have the latest iteration have all kinds of additional new tweaks and changes and new problems that didn't exist before, that's when I feel the need to just go into extreme detail, because that's what I'm doing myself anyway. So, again, if you have any comments about this or any experience with this, please do comment below and we will keep the discussion going. So please do keep supporting both studio and boutique labels wherever possible with purchasing good, properly made archival releases of catalog films to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And thank you ever so much for watching.